Okay. My name's Roger Murray. I'm a geologist and Vice President of Geology and Engineering with Anglo-Swiss Texas Offshore Partners / MEGO. And I'd like to begin with providing a brief geologic overview of the various reservoirs that we'll be discussing in much more detail later on in this presentation. I will begin with the outline map, which illustrates the three-block area that we are discussing in Matagorda 665, along with an outline of the various reservoir units. The main point I want to make is that these reservoirs are located in the extensional tectonic regime, typical of the western Gulf of Mexico, South Texas region. These sediments, or the area is characterized by sediment loading upon an underlying shale unit, which was later deformed, giving rise to the various structures in the area. Specifically, the reservoirs are located on a large, elongate, rollover anticlinal ridge on the downthrown side of a very large regional listric fault. This is very typical of all of the western Gulf of Mexico, onshore and offshore Texas. There's nothing unique in terms of the tectonics of the area. The reservoirs that are under discussion can be divided into three different units. We have the shallow Miocene reservoirs, which are at a depth of roughly 1,500 feet to 4,000 feet subsea. These reservoirs are numerically labeled 2 through 8 in ascending order as one goes deeper. Underlying the shallow Miocene reservoirs, we have the Rob C reservoir, which was called MM80 when Exxon was operating the block. The Rob C is found at a depth of roughly 5,500 feet to 5,600 feet below sea level. Beneath the Rob C, we have the MARGE A section, where we have the MARGE A prospect. This is an undrilled section at a depth of around between 8,500 and 10,000 feet, depending on where on the structure you're located. The main point, again, is that the tectonic elements that are associated with these reservoirs are typical of the western Gulf of Mexico basin. Depositionally, all of the three reservoir units can be described quite nicely with a generic depositional model that was developed by the Bureau of Economic Geology in Austin, which described a typical depositional sequence which begins with sediments being transported into the basin across a shelf edge into the deeper water. These initial sediments are in the form of basin floor fans and turbidites. As more and more sediments are deposited within the basin, the underlying shales become mobilized. This causes a tilting of the initial sediments, which forms the structural configuration that we see in the area. As sedimentation proceeds, deltaic sands are transported into the area. The deltaic sands are typically much coarser grained, thicker sands, high porosity, high permeability, very typical of all of offshore Gulf of Mexico area. The turbidites and basin floor fans, which are associated with the initial phases of sedimentation, are the sediments that we are targeting within the MARGE A prospect. As sedimentation proceeds, delta systems prograde out and eventually fill the remaining accommodation space. The deltaic sands are the typical offshore Gulf of Mexico sands, high porosity, high permeability, very thick, massive sands. Periodically, sea level has risen and fallen in the area. As sea level rises, the deltaic sediments have been flooded and reworked. These reworked and sandstones are associated with the Rob C reservoir that we have in this area. The Rob C is a result of this transgressive system. Following the transgressive episodes, we'll have additional deltaic sands being deposited, and quite often these cycles repeat themselves. Within this particular area, I think these cycles have been repeated 4 times. The shallow Miocene reservoirs are associated with the deltaic systems, but they're also associated with a series of incised channels which cut across the deltaics in a perpendicular fashion. These incised channels are very easy to delineate on the seismic data and have been developed quite nicely by the shallow Miocene wells within the 3-block area. The main point I would like to make in regards to the geologic model that we have applied to this area is the fact that the model is highly predictable and highly consistent with the entire offshore Texas region. This consistency allows us to predict the types of sands that we will encounter within the undrilled MARGE A prospect, and also helps us understand some of the issues that we've encountered in the Rob C reservoir and the shallow Miocene reservoirs. So the consistency of the model is sort of a foundation that we are using to support the undrilled MARGE A prospect. Our exploration efforts within the shallow Miocene reservoir was guided, as I mentioned earlier, by an understanding of the incised channels across that are observed across the area. These channels are associated with amplitude anomalies, which in turn is associated with the gas content of the sands, but we can also see and predict variations in reservoir quality due to the variations in the amplitudes. Most of these amplitude anomalies within the shallow Miocene section have been drilled and are now associated with the PDP reserves. Within the Rob C section, the seismic data was used primarily to delineate the aerial extent of the Rob C section. The gas water contact was never encountered within any given well, so the aerial extent, the gross aerial extent of the reservoir was delineated with the seismic data. Within the MARGE A reservoir, or within the MARGE A prospect, there is an amplitude anomaly associated with the target sands, but the overall variation and distribution of amplitudes is associated with the stratigraphic distribution of the sands. The sands are, as I mentioned earlier, are associated with turbidites and basin floor fans. These typically have nice thick feeder channels which can be delineated often on seismic data, and in this case they are also associated with some abnormal amplitude anomalies, which we postulate is associated with gas content within the sands. The Rob C reservoir, as I mentioned earlier, is associated with a transgressive systems tract which has reworked a pre-existing deltaic sand system. As the transgressive occurs, sea level rises and begins to rework and flood the pre-existing topography. These types of systems typically give rise to a barrier island system along the shoreline. And we see that quite nicely in the Robb Sea when you look at an amplitude map where we have the Robb Sea is elongate in a northeast-southwest direction, roughly 4 or 5 miles in length. The northwest-southeast dimension is much thinner, on the order of 1 to 2 miles. If you look at the morphology of that amplitude distribution and the variations in amplitude, it's very similar to what we see in a typical barrier island today. An example of that is the Kiowa Island off South Carolina, where we've illustrated a modern-day topographic map. And as you can see, the barrier island has a classic drumstick shape or morphology to it, with a very thin area to the southwest, thickening to the northeast. We have a very similar configuration associated with our Robb Sea map in offshore Texas. So this is just further confirmation that we think the Robb Sea reservoir is associated with a barrier island system created in a transgressive systems tract. Another indicator for transgressive barrier island systems is the presence of, within the Robb Sea, of discrete calcite cemented zones. These calcite cements are derived from seashell hash or lag deposits, which are diagnostic of transgressive barrier island systems. The shell hash, through diagenesis, becomes calcite cemented zones. These are easily identified on the well logs and cores in virtually every well that penetrates the Robb Sea section. And finally, the third piece of evidence that supports this transgressive model is the presence of a consistent marine shale condensed section at the top of the Robb Sea section. This marine shale section provides the seal for the entire Robb Sea reservoir.